Everybody, I've been putting this off for a while, but I wanted to review this excellent, and I think for many years overlooked album by Cat Stevens, Mona Bones Jakon, 1970. I hope you'll consider watching.
I sit beside the dark in the mild, cold, gray, dusty day. The morning lake drinks up the sky. Catman, you, I'll soon be seeing you. And your strange bewildering time will hold me down.
Well, before we get started, I just wanted to take a minute to share a little blurb. I've always been hesitant to say much about it, but this is my book, The Art of Ancient Music. It's available on Amazon. I'm not trying to sell it. That's why I always kind of didn't want to say too much about it. But if you're interested in the history of music and how music developed out of very primitive circumstances a long time ago, I think you might enjoy this book. And there's a paperback version and a hardcover version. It was written to be kind of scholarly and hopefully well written, but also accessible to general readers. And I looked through Amazon and some of the other books on ancient music, and they always seem like either they were written for kids, and there's nothing wrong with that, but that's what a lot of them seem like, or they were written by people that were writing for 9 other graduate students and were way irrelevant to most people's interests. Not to mention, a lot of them didn't seem like they'd been written by people who played music or even liked music that much. They were kind of academic exercises. So that book, I was kind of proud of it, and I think you'd enjoy it if you ever get a chance to look through it. Like I said, I'm not trying to sell it per se, but I just wanted to let you know that it's out there, and certainly be delighted to have you pick up a copy. But this is Mona Bones Jakon. This is a great album. Might be one of my favorite Cat Stevens albums, actually. I bought this, I think, in 9th grade, so it was one of the early Cat Stevens albums I bought. I was trying to remember the order I bought them in. I'm pretty sure Teaser and the Firecat was the first Cat Stevens album I ever got. You might have heard me say I traded Elton John's Greatest Hits to a guy in our Boy Scout troop for Teaser and the Firecat, and he was happy with the trade, and so was I, and I've still got that copy. And I got Teaser and the Firecat. I think Catch Bullet 4 was maybe the next album I ever got, because I remember hearing that in junior high, and I went and bought that one. Then Buddha and the Chocolate Box actually was around that time. That was a new album back then, and I think I bought that one pretty early on. Around that time, I bought this album. So I've had this album since I was maybe 14. I think before I turned 15, but I don't remember exactly. But it's an excellent album. And I've always thought it was kind of underrated. You know, when I was a kid, I think that was more true. People always talked about Teaser and the Firecat, and this was like pretty serious Cat Stevens fans might know about this, but most of the public did not. And that was at a time when Cat Stevens was huge. You know, he was huge like Elton John, huge, for a few years there in the 70s. Definitely one of the biggest stars in the world, particularly in singer-songwriter music, but just huge. And I would say this album was pretty unknown. It's kind of an interesting album. He did this album after he started out his career doing Matthew and Son and New Masters. And then he got tuberculosis and was in a sanitarium for quite a while with tuberculosis. My aunt and uncle, this would be in the 30s before I ever was born, but they had tuberculosis and had to go to a sanitarium. And I know that one of the things they did in that sanitarium was they were encouraged to play music. I think my uncle played the saxophone, and I don't know, I think wind instruments in particular, but maybe singing. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but I think Cat Stevens came out with that sanitarium with a lot of new songs, and I think some of the songs off Tea for the Tiller Man, if not even further on, were written in that one period. Into White's, sometimes people seem to associate it with that time he was in the sanitarium, which is a great song off Tea for the Tiller Man. But anyway, this was his first album coming back, and he had totally reinvented himself. Totally reinvented himself. If you watch like old clips of him from that New Masters and Matthew and Son period, he looks a lot to me like Engelbert Humperdinck, and he's very swing in London. He's kind of Matthew and Son. He kind of snaps his fingers, and he dances, and you don't see him much with the guitar. He's kind of like Tom Jones or Engelbert Humperdinck, or who else was like that? Kind of maybe one of the star you might have seen singing with a microphone like this back on Johnny Carson at that time. Kind of a swingy lounge singer almost, or pop singer. But I listened to those albums again, New Masters and Matthew and Son. I drive sometimes on Sunday morning. I play the piano in a church, and I was listening to them not too long ago. And I said, man, the arrangements are so different, because you hear horns, and like I said, it sounds a lot like an Engelbert Humperdinck album or a Johnny Mathis album or something like that almost. But when you listen to underlying songs, you go, that's Cat Stevens. The songwriting is there. And there's one song that he does from that early period. It's called Portobello Road. It's just him and an acoustic guitar. And I think that early period, that's one where you can really hear the future Cat Stevens. And in this Monobones Jakon, he kind of, that I think was the kind of music he liked to play, that really kind of authentic music that emphasized the guitar. The guitars are part of like kind of pop rock arrangements, very late 60s style pop rock arrangements on those first two albums. But on Monobones Jakon, he came out, it's a bona fide folk album. And the other interesting thing about that, when a lot of us, when we hear folk, we think of fairly big production folk, because even like James Taylor, I don't know, John Denver, a lot of those albums, by the time we hear them on the radio, they've been, they might even have strings and things and many instruments. But I'm talking about folk like you might hear in a coffee house, where it's just a couple guitars and maybe a bass and, just sparse instrumentation, which is great. And that's actually like Simon and Garfunkel. The true Simon and Garfunkel was just two people singing with one guitar, and they sometimes would add instrumentation to that. So you end up hearing it on the radio with kind of a fuller sound. But I mean the true folk, which is pretty sparse a lot of times. You might, and it's live. And this, I think, is the album closest to that he ever did. So he kind of got out of whatever world he was in with those first two albums. And this was a real departure. I would say this was almost as big of a conversion as when he converted to Yusuf Islam. Literally, if you look at how he was in like 1968, and then you look at this, it's as big of a change as when he converted to Islam, I think, maybe. Really, it's a huge change. And yet, kind of along those same lines, it's also Cat Stevens or Steven Giorgio. But this is a really good album. And I think by paring everything down, he emphasized the songs more. There are really good songs on those first two albums. They're Cat Stevens songs, and they're excellent. Look at the first cut is the deepest was on there. Here Comes My Baby. But the arrangements kind of clouded it. And even though it's kind of catchy, you might tap your foot to it or you could hear it on the radio, it kind of clouded the purity and the simplicity of the greatest Cat Stevens songs, which I think are on those first folksy albums. And this is the folksiest of his folk albums. And he added Alun Davies, which was a great guitar duo partnership. And you can watch on YouTube now. This would have been obscure when I was a kid, but it's great now. That's one advantage of being older. I can kind of remember, and you would have never seen that when I was a kid. But you can watch like old BBC footage of him from around this time, just playing with that Alun Davies. I think they have a bass player. I should know. It's on here. It's a guy named John Ryan who plays bass. But you can see him just playing in that little trio. It's kind of like looking at old Jim Croce live, which is very rare, but it's just him and that Marty Muhausen, or some of those trios, or Simon and Garfunkel, where it's truly just a couple instruments, and that's true old folk music. which is what you would probably hear if you go to a coffee house, or what you would hear, just a couple guitars, people singing, and that it's very seldom that music that sparse makes it onto the radio, unless you're listening to like NPR or some kind of late night special or something. But this is an excellent English folk album, and I think that must have been in there all the time. And like I said, I don't think the songwriting is just Cat Stevens' songwriting, but he just cut out all that other extraneous stuff and came out with this album. It's really just got Cat Stevens on, I think, guitar and then piano, but also a guy named John Ryan on bass, Harvey Burns on percussion. And you notice they use the term percussion. There's not much drums on here. Some of these songs are just maybe a guitar or two, maybe a little light piano. One interesting thing is it's got Peter Gabriel, who plays the flute on that little song Catmandu, and I did a little cover of Catmandu a little while ago. That's one of Cat Stevens' finest little songs. He's got all those little songs, kind of like The Wind. I guess Moonshadow is kind of like that. It got so famous, it's hard to think of it that way, but just one of those little kind of ditty songs, And Catmandu is like that. It's just one of those little songs that you can kind of finger pick. You don't need much at all to play it, just a guitar or two, if that, But Peter Gabriel's on that. And the other thing I wanted to say about this is, even though it's a folk album, and a lot of us when we hear folk, we think Peter, Paul, and Mary, and that's great. I love Peter, Paul, and Mary, or early Dylan. But sometimes you also hear like prog rock. And I've often thought that if Cat Stevens had played into the 80s, he could have been a great prog rock artist, because if you listen to like Buddha in the Chocolate Box, like King of Trees, that's like prog rock. And I find it interesting, he was friends with Peter Gabriel on this album, and that was great from Genesis. And then on Teaser and the Firecat, he had Rick Wakeman play. So I don't think prog rock was out of the question, and I think you hear that a lot on some of his later stuff. So it's kind of funny, he got rid of all that extra instrumentation from his first two albums to do this, which is just pared down to the bare bones, and he kind of started adding instrumentation back. I guess Foreigner would be one example. But like if you listen to a song on here called Time, it's got that feeling like could have been kind of like Emerson, Lake and Palmer from the beginning, or some of those Yes songs that have such nice acoustic guitar, like In You and I. At the heart of Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes and Genesis too often were just great songs that were kind of atmospheric, kind of interesting, but not crazy, just good, kind of like singer-songwriter songs. And he's got that Time on here, which you could almost hear as a prog rock song, and it's but I found it interesting that he's got Peter Gabriel, because when I talked about Buddha in the Chocolate Box a few months ago, that's one of the things I said is Buddha in the Chocolate Box wants to be a prog rock album. Some of the songs on there could have been like a Genesis, Trick of the Tail, or Lamb Lies Down on Broadway kind of stuff, Cinema Show, Dance on a Volcano. I could see Cat Stevens from that period doing any of that. But this is just a fantastic album. And you know what? I think his songwriting might have got a little better on, I think, the quality of songs, maybe they're more memorable songs on Tea for the Tiller Man and Teaser and the Firecat, both of which kind of continue in this tradition. And probably Catch Bullet 4 too. Now you could say Foreigner was a kind of a departure from this. He added a lot of instruments. And that album didn't do that well, but those first couple albums were kind of building off what he started here, and they're terrific. But I think maybe the songwriting in some cases, you might say kind of seasoned as a songwriter. But this is a great album. I love Catmandu. Mona Bon Jakon, that song, and the name of the album was kind of a sexual innuendo about his stem of Jesse's rod, as the good book says, his sexual organs. And that always kind of reminds me of John Sebastian and the Lovin' Spoonful, or the rock band 10cc, both of which were kind of cryptic sexual references you might have heard about. But this has a bunch of good songs on it. Lily White, that is beautiful. I remember Lily White, I learned pretty early, because when I had this album, I was still very much in a learning stage of guitar, and several of these songs were pretty easy to learn. And one of them I remember learning like 8th or 9th grade was Lily White. And I think I See the Light, that's kind of a rocker with piano. Trouble, trouble, oh, trouble set me free. Maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. That Catmandu is just great. Fill My Eyes. Probably the most famous song on here maybe is Lady D'Arbanville, which was about Patti D'Arbanville, who was a friend of the female persuasion that he had. And I think she kind of was his friend going back to the swinging London days. And I guess their relationship didn't end up, working out or whatever. And I read an interview with him, and she called him Stevie, and so I guess his friends in that period still called him Stephen Giorgio. I wonder if anyone still today calls him Stephen. I noticed she called him Stephen, but he's got that Lady D'Arbanville, which has kind of both a Latin flavor and also kind of a medieval flavor. Whenever I hear English folk, it always connects me a little bit to what I imagine medieval music sounding like. I guess I might say that about Appalachian music too, more than some of the American folk, which sounds a little bit like we might call country type music without an accent. But a lot of that English folk is really good. Lady D'Arbanville has kind of a Latin flavor and also kind of got that troubadour feel. One thing I was wondering about that is if a woman would mind if you named her so specifically in a song and put it on a world release album. I don't know. Especially if it didn't work out, he uses her actual name. And, I don't know. I was just wondering about that. I was wondering if he would do that today as an older man. He was pretty young when he did this, or if in 2023 we would welcome someone doing that in the same way. But I don't know. But it's definitely a great song. It's probably the most famous song on here. But this is a great album. If you haven't heard it, I definitely recommend picking it up. And I've got the vinyl. There's not much to the vinyl. I don't think this is a rare case where I don't think you got the lyrics in it, because this is my old copy, and unless they were on the sleeve and I lost them, they weren't on here. Whereas I think the Cat Stevens album subsequently always made a point of having those lyrics, because lyrics were just absolutely integral to his music, which is true good songwriting. But it's a simple album. It's pared down. But if you get a chance to listen to this album, I would definitely listen to this album, because it's definitely outstanding. And I'm not just saying it's interesting. If you like Cat Stevens, you can kind of hear his early stuff or something. I think it's just probably the truest folk album he ever did. Although, Teaser and the Firecat and Tea for the Tillerman are very folksy. I think especially side one of Teaser and the Firecat has that really pared down feel, as does a lot of Tea for the Tillerman. And you notice I think that's what people remember him most for today. So he kind of departed from that a little bit in Foreigner. I happen to like Buddha in the Chocolate Box, but that is also a departure from that really pared down, simple, just him and that Alun Davies playing those simple but beautiful guitar parts. And that's what you get on here. And this was the beginning of that Alun Davies Cat Stevens partnership, which was just alchemy. They just played so well together. And neither of them are flashy guitar players, but they both are very musical. They finger pick. They play with musicality and good. And the songwriting was always so creative. And when you have that, you don't need a lot else. And this proves it. You don't need a lot. You got great songs, good singers, and a couple good guitar players. You don't need much else. And this is a damn good album. If you haven't heard it, you should get it. Not just to complete your collection or because it's interesting to hear this part of this chapter in his life or something. It's just a flat out excellent album. Thanks. God bless.